I am back. Well, thank you all for coming. If anyone else drops in, we can write on the chat that if you have any questions, you can message on the side. So let me type that. All right. Shall I kick off at the 5-minute mark? It looks like
Yeah,
it.
would you like a quick intro?
Yeah, for sure. So do you want to introduce me or me?
Yeah, I can do a brief introduction. Deger Turan is the CEO of a company called Cerebro that does large-scale machine learning input. These days, mostly for retail companies to figure out like how they should adjust their operations in response to market signals. But along the way, Cerebro also did some experiments with more political and economic applications of the same ideas, which are closely related to the statistics of stories projects that we've been excited about at ALI. And Deger is also a senior research fellow with us. And so this talk is to examine one of those past applications and what we can learn from it.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. So let me give a quick background on myself. So I'm the CEO and founder at Cerebro. And before Cerebro, a lot of my work was actually on forecasting shifts of public opinion and shifts of demand. So when I was at Stanford University, I was working with Andrew Ng and Dan Jarafsky on working with a couple of federal agencies in being able to help them understand what the large amounts of feedback they were receiving were about, specifically with the FCC on net neutrality, Bureau of Land Management for Keystone XL pipeline. What are people talking about and how can we slice and dice this in a way that both enables the citizens to be able to hold the central agency accountable and also for the central agency to be able to make sense of all the signals that are coming in. So I'd love to share my journey with natural language processing and event detection, which is what a lot of the tech that I've explored goes towards, and then discuss all together at the latter half of the session, where can we go from there? So I am screen sharing, if you can see. I'll walk through a deck for a little bit, and then we can shift gears. If you have any questions, just write it on the chat on the side, and I'm happy to chime in more. So ultimately, the thing I want to focus on is how can we use natural language processing and AI for improving civic discourse, and who cares? Like, what is this good for? The central question that inspired me to explore this was, how can we understand which issues are most pressing for the communities that we are living in? So for that, I always like to go back to the first instance of, large-scale feedback collection in 18th century in France. So Ledger of Complaints, Cahiers de Doléances. This started in 1789 in France, kicked off by King Louis XVI. He basically said, let's give to each of the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, a flow through which they can give us public feedback. The Ledger of Complaints sounds exactly like what it is. They set up a bunch of literal notebooks in different churches and gave a chance to express everyone, for there was some unsettling movements that were happening throughout the empire, so that people can express their hopes and grievances directly to the king. And the king would be able to organize these in three categories. And they thought this would be a way to calm the people at the rise of an economic crisis. Well, we know what happened 2 months later. That started with this. The French Revolution kicked off from the very first, large-scale feedback collection process. And this opened a whole new direction of thinking from a policymaking perspective. De Tocqueville, one of the early thinkers on modern democracy, said, feedback collection is really the last relic of the old regime. People's voice is God's voice, like Vox Populi, Vox Dei, as a phrase that came up quite often. People said, at that point, this was much more obvious to the early thinkers around democracy on the early modern age, that there is a binary conflict between liberty and equality, where when we are listening to everyone and trying to give voices to them, people expected this to naturally hamper a lot of aspects on liberty. While we today connect these passionately under the same umbrella of democracy, this wouldn't have been obvious. When we ask people what they care about, is there any guarantee that they will actually act in their best interest, or will they talk about what is top of mind for them? The political ventriloquism angle is something that is fairly reminiscent of social media today. Is, as the early French period said, is the aristocracy planting words to people's channels. So I'm curious if there are any guesses on what do you think people asked for? What was the most common complaint that came up in the books of grievances? Any guesses?
Sanitary?
Close, actually. So the most common thing that came up throughout was that dovecotes should be destroyed, and there should be no way for pigeons to be able to look around, especially in planting and harvest. This was really the biggest vision that was most common throughout France. Out of everything that could be around taxes or role of church or being able to collect feedback, no, this was the very most important point that was most common. Truth is, like, we don't actually know what people care about until we give them the microphone. So how can we establish channels is the question that I was always curious about, where we can continuously receive quality feedback that people can also see and say, okay, this is ridiculous that this is the most common denominator at the verge of a total collective crisis. So what can we do from here? Jump a little faster. The questions that I've always been interested in is, can we build systems that can bring three main pillars where referendums are falling short, things are reduced to binary choices in that case. So we're suggesting options that, knowing that there's already a limited set of civic participation channels. We know one-time surveys don't really help either. So can we come up with a flow that can sustain, one, transparency with data? Let every participant, let every citizen present where they are standing at, how their opinion compares to everyone else, and have them have that visibility. Two, can we establish accountability where the central agency and the citizens can both hold each other accountable to participation by basically making it clear what has been said? Everyone is able to see this discourse and try to understand what this is about, which means, see what the bots are, see different ways in which we can sample this kind of collective feedback. Some voices are drowned out when you do a random sample. It might be a small opinion. Can you still make sure that it gets the visibility? It is acknowledged. This is the third principle on this side as well. So I don't want to go into the technical structure and the complexity there too much, but I'll run very quickly. Basically, a lot of the tech that I have been working on connects external and internal text sources that an entity has been working with, be it, what's happening in news sources, social network. Let's connect this with any kind of multiple choice or behavioral feedback that we can see. Behavioral might be, when did someone sign in? How often have they come to the platform of feedback or any other place that we can track their behavior to be able to identify if this is form letter motivated or if this is an individual contributor or if this is a bot or did an event trigger this? Being able to identify expert submission and demographic information as well to be able to see two different ways in which we can look at this. And for the question we are asking, let's come up with a domain-specific ontology that can help us identify what are the core themes we should be on the lookout for. From there on, both the events, think of it as a multimodal system. The events that are coming in both from the text angle and behavioral angle, everything needs to be vectorized in a way that can be compared and contrasted with each other. So we can identify what are specific events that have motivated surges or declines, and how is this conversation likely to evolve from there. So this has been the angle that I've been most interested in throughout the last couple of years. A lot of work in clustering. I'd love to show a quick snippet from actually again, we're going back to France here for the most recent large-scale data collection process, which was with the French government in 2019 called the Grand Débat, where they collected about 2 million open-ended submissions, about 5 million individual, text snippets that were shared with the government on a series of leading questions on how should the public budget be allocated. In a way, what happened in 2019 was really similar to the eve of the French Revolution, where the government said, okay, there's massive unrest kicking off with the Yellow Vest movement that are taking place in France. What can we do to be able to give people the room to be able to share their voice? But also, having learned from what happened.
If you hit slideshow, it might make that larger so people can read it.
Oh, I see. How do I do that?
It's the white button slideshow in the top right.
There we go. All right. Yeah, so the question at hand is, well, I'm going to shift windows in a way in a little bit, but The circumstances were very similar to right before the French Revolution in a way, where there was massive economic fear that was at the hand of people. The Yellow Vest movement started larger and larger scale protests throughout France, and it was obvious that the government was positioned in a way where people thought they aren't actually paying attention to what people want them to do. So there was about 2 million submitters for 5 million open-ended submissions on a variety of questions. And we actually work with a couple of think tanks in France, the most important being Fondapol, which was Macron's own think tank, on coming up with methodologies through which it is not a one-time clustering, but actually a dynamic platform that anyone can come and play with the data. Now, I'll show you a very quick demo snippet on the way the workflow works. So basically, there's a series of different questions that they were focusing on. For example, ecological transition, or how shall we organize, public services for the state, et cetera, et cetera. For each of these questions, people have been giving open-ended feedback on what they want to be focused. I am going to actually try translating this so we all can see it in English. So and from there on, you can see easily by category what were the most important things. For example, this around, how should be funding around transportation be allocated. And we made this available interface for both the the members of the think tank, and also people that they would like to share it with. And you could see not just on a pie chart on what percent of the submitters are focusing on this, but also the distribution they had. For example, electrical vehicles was very clear that only this was something that came from the most metropolitan cities, but in those parts this was actually quite significant. For you still get about 1,000 times more significance than the average subject that was mentioned in this question. The interesting part here is that instead of giving multiple choice questions to the participants, this comes up with an open-ended communication flow where if enough people start paying attention to a certain angle, this will actually increase the focus that's on the subject. And from there on, if this was turned and evolved into a continuous collective feedback flow, this would have been brilliant for being able to facilitate a discussion that sustains through time and not seen as a one-time, data collection. We can go through this. There's plenty here. I'll defer that for later a little bit, and I do want to come back to the presentation side. So the question was, okay, we did this. What did the French government do from here now that they've learned their lesson from the last iteration? Instead of building this as a continuous feedback flow, what they said was, let's do a one-off. We collected your feedback. Thank you. We're closing the Grand Débat comment submissions period. And from now onwards, what we will do is we will publish this on the news as, what were the 10 most important things. And as you can imagine, a lot of the bullets that were brought up were fairly obvious and light, such as people said we should care about healthcare. People said we should care about elderly. It basically fizzled out and the PR crisis was averted. There was a little bit of a discussion that was around, can we turn the Grand Débat into a civic, the citizens collective that can continuously collect more feedback for providing an avenue for people to be able to give this information. That also fizzled out without, taking substantial traction. While the data collection was taking place, people were actually very excited about this communication flow to exist. It actually made a brief reappearance also during the re-elections, again, with Macron as part of his platform. Again, I wonder if this will go anywhere through the re-elections. So what did I do? Having tried this in a couple different ways around, government agencies, I said, can I find any other sector, literally anything else, where I can prove the thesis of being able to derive value from the questions, like the kinds of things that we would be able to get to is, what percent of people cared about what and how did this information evolve? Many different from governance to activism, So I said, can I look at any other sector where we can turn this into multimodal workflow? And one that I came across was retail. For unlike the government, the retailers really need to care about what people want and what people need. Otherwise, they go out of business. So voting with their money seems to be more sustainable than just making sure you do enough for a re-election. So that is where we found actually a really interesting product market fit, if I may call it, and turn this into a multimodal workflow. I'll show you again a quick snippet from that angle of a similar logic. This is all open source data. I'll describe some of the extent that we can do, but in a way, the logic is fairly language agnostic. For example, this is a set of product reviews in Japanese from Uniqlo that highlights what are the specific reasons why their bra products are interesting. For example, I don't feel like I'm even wearing it was a very common theme, or I don't feel like I'm getting enough hold was a very common negative feedback theme that is going live right now. As in, these are the pieces that people are mentioning in this very iteration. For any topic, you can dive in and drill in to see more. This is actually much more interesting when you connect this with metadata. So Uniqlo is one of our main clients. I can't show you any of their proprietary data parts, but basically in those angles, what you would be able to see on top of the reviews is also, is there any correlation of these with conversion or with inventory replenishment or with our marketing challenges? And that is when we found it's actually fairly interesting to be able to turn the content that is coming in from unstructured signals, connecting the behavior of how people are navigating through the website with the reviews, which is, the text feedback that people are giving. And that was the product that we continued on developing. Now, the question I'm interested in is, I got the validation I wanted in a way of my thesis that, this workflow is actually very relevant for an entity that is accountable to its, what would you call it? Like constituents, I guess. In a retail case, it would be all of their users. Now, my question is, as I try to find, which angle do I want to focus on in my career, where do we go from here? We live in a moment where, it is fairly strong on the post-truth era. We are not sure what is right. We are not sure what is correct, really. So can we find data, from, outside signals? Say, can we look at Twitter to be able to do this without really being tied to a government saying, hey, we will collect this data? Can we do this with activist groups? The problem with anything that comes from social media is that the content that we get will not really be of a level of quality. Data integrity is really crucial. Like, social media is not built for civic discourse. It's really more built for hype maximization and a lot of addictive user behavior, which also cues towards some of the questions of political ventriloquism that we were talking about. There's a lot of different ways in which any feedback collection can also be tampered with. And these are also very important. Like, for example, even when you collect intentionally, this is still a problem. Like Keystone XL pipeline submissions, there were 9 submissions of the Great Gatsby as a full text. There were 2 Samsung Galaxy manuals. I still remember these, for being able to see where can we go from the data that we're collecting. One theme that came up quite a bit recently was around, civic intervention, basically with bots, etc. This was fairly big on, the FCC net neutrality discussions. There is a way to turn ambiguity or unclarity in your data to a statement, which I think is actually really interesting. Anything that is small scale but disturbs the data, being able to create visibility into that is also really powerful. If you lack data on a subject, let's turn that into a statement. If we get flooded by bots, let's turn that into a statement as well. Instead of filtering them out, we can show what they're trying to do. Is it a foreign intervention? Let's show how endemic discourse hate speech looks like, and then show how the ambiguous data source hate speech looks like. Let's outline the differences. There's a lot of ways in which we can see that the thing that we're trying to filter out might actually have a lot of really important answers in the discussions as well, which is around, finding the missing points in the data into a statement. I do want to talk about 2 more angles that I've been thinking about, and then kind of shift to where can we go from here. Instead of trying to, make the AI make a final judgment, one of the things that is really clear to everyone is like, what is a valuable opinion? What is a bot? What is a form letter? Did I copy paste a phrase and said, I care about this now because I see the form letter from a news source that I care about and I took that into action? Is it more important than someone that actually wrote their own copy? I think these are important questions from a perspective of core decision making. However, from our perspective on AI for transparency, accountability, and visibility, all we need to do is actually to document this at the highest fidelity, to be able to say, yes, we got only 3,000 individual contributors and 50,000 form letter submissions. All of those form letter submissions are in a cluster that is tightly connected to each other. And we can see the cloud of similar other opinions that is around as well. Let's draw that out in a way that is actually navigatable for people and understand where they are. And there's a lot of, very slight variations that bots will take. Again, a lot of these are fairly well documented. The question then becomes, is there any entity right now that would be able to take into account large amounts of text data, combine that with behavioral signals as well, to be able to help for better representation? And ideally, to be able to turn these into action courses as well. I do want to jump ahead a little bit to here, for I would love to actually take, the latter half of our discussion as just like an open-ended discussion. Where can we go from here? This is the part that I've been thinking about the most. So there's a couple different angles on the workflow that we can have, which is, let's scale a conversation from roundtable to more than 100 million. We can consolidate the public feedback and connect this with any other open-ended data source. Let citizens' data drive the decision making and make it transparent how the consolidation process works as well, from it being open source, so that we can provide a concise summary that is not limited by any human capacity. And from there on, there's many angles that this can go towards: participatory budgeting, to citizen juries, to public deliberation processes. So that's what I'd love to discuss a little bit. There's 5 angles that I have been thinking about lately. Some of these in conversations with people at AI, others with other folks that have been exploring on where we can go. The first one that jumps out quite a bit, which is the highest fidelity to my previous iterations, was, let's look at regulatory feedback and cognitive consonance, meaning, is there a way in which we can demonstrate explicitly whether or not the actions of an entity, this could be you yourself or a politician or a nonprofit, is in consonance with the people they claim to represent? And if it's an individual, is in consonance with itself directly. I think this is fairly interesting, for we actually do this quite a bit already on Twitter, especially coming after a lot of politicians that are literally taking place right now. Is there a way where we can scale this up to be able to point out through a system that anyone can use? Or there could be different ways in which we can model data / make that piece modular as well, so people can try different clustering strategies or transformer strategies to be able to come to their own conclusions as well, in a way to be able to bolster cognitive consonance. So that is one side. Another side that I thought there is a lot of interesting movement happening is with respect to citizen shareholder rights. So a lot of people that basically have, like, if you have a pension plan, you actually have a voice. And probably, the pension plan you're holding is going towards a lot of fairly large companies. But if you can get even just 5% of these votes that is fairly distributed across, you would be able to say, hey, the suggestion that we want to make as a collective needs to be taken into account. There's actually a lot of room that is coming up there for people that are, there might be people here that are invested in companies that we don't even know about, that we're a shareholder for. And currently these flows, while they don't exist, there's a lot of work being done on that front. The third one that I was curious about is collective decision-making systems. What do I mean by this? Is there a way in which we can empower any group to be able to give their feedback in a way that is streamlined, so that they can make a case for what they would like to make a case for? That sounded very high level. Let's make it. I'm actually going to connect these two into one bullet to be able to really pin it down. Say, for example, home, like taking a loan so that you can get a home. There is a lot of bias on this system to African Americans in the United States, for just the racial background on its own makes a lot of, even friends of mine, I've heard this, say that they won't be eligible for a loan, and they're not really sure why. Now, there's actually a lot of possibility to be able to collectively make a case that combines not just text feedback, but also behavioral feedback, such as, your bank statement, etc. Your financials in the last. And in a way to be able to collect and consolidate this through a flow that is opt-in for everyone, that does create a win-win dynamic where the participants say, yeah, I do want to be able to get a better loan, so I want to be part of this collective data share / consolidation movement, so that my case is taken into account just as the rest, and continue from there. The other angle of this is directly plugging this into financial systems. Again, trying to get a loan is a very obvious case where, in a lot of times, the nuances of a specific workflow, be it, a sector that is, struggling to be able to explain what is taking place. I've seen this quite a bit in retail and retail lending slash financing, or home ownership or insurance. For example, why can't all, like, I'll give an example that I've been thinking about lately. It's again ties into this workflow. There's a lot of people that are working at company A, let's say, that eat the food that company A serves about 10 times a week. Just the fact that the diets of these people have been fairly streamlined through the company is a very noteworthy data point for an insurance, the health insurance that this company will provide for their employees. This won't be taken into account in a systematic fashion. Can we come up with ways in which every participant in a system, be it open-ended feedback or multiple choice feedback, doesn't really matter, is able to express ways in which their identity, their thoughts, their behaviors should be taken into account better for the decision making of central identities, central entities? That is the question that I'm most interested in exploring. So we have about 30 minutes more. When I was talking with Peter and Brittany, I was saying it would actually be great to shift the gears from here into a discussion to see, what are ideas that we have all together that we would like to explore. Ultimately, the tech that we can bring as the core backbone can connect raw text with behavioral signal, heck, even with image data if that is necessary, to be able to consolidate large groups of similar behavior and public opinion. Where can we go from here? How can we use it? So I'd love to ask that question to all of us. Yeah. I think from now on, we can, I'm going to stop presenting also, and I'd love for it to be a discussion between all of us. So yeah, Richard, take it away.
Oh, I was just going to ask if you can comment on the state of the art with respect to sort of abstractive summarization for creating these clusters. So I noticed that you're doing statistically significant phrase detection essentially, and topic modeling, and doing clustering from those. But is it possible to abstract out an unknown n number of things that are being asked for, out of millions of asks for a given question, and just come up with the top 100 or so clusters conceptually?
I will keep an answer on high level, and then we can decide to dive in. There's two sides to this. One of them is the simple fancier versions of a k-means clustering, which is what is the top 100, what is the top 1,000 individual clusters that I could pay attention to. Similarly, the other side of the metric.
Sorry, just to clarify here. So I'm not talking about in terms of the topic. I'm talking about in terms of the detailed ask.
What do you mean by the detailed ask?
It could be probably most tersely expressed as a whole sentence. I would like for the public transportation systems to be to run much more often at nighttime,
right,
or on the weekends, let's say.
The question you're asking is, what are ways in which we can come up with clusters that are working with full sentences rather than individual extracted themes, say
Right, and not verbatims from the data, but abstracted ones.
Right, so there's two takes here. The first side of that is, do we want to break the pieces down and reconstitute it versus stay high fidelity to the original text? I've actually explored both of these quite a bit. So on one side, what we can do is to turn everything into the smallest tokens that we can, pair these tokens with the context in which they exist, which is their sentiment alignment, all the way down to the time of the submission or the demographics of the submitter, et cetera, et cetera. And from these, build its ground back. That's what I call reconstituting the submission. This is fairly heavy and rule-based. However, this really enriches the final output. Instead of it coming from a fairly hands-off neural nets transformer system, you really are able to see, okay, I am seeing a group where everyone shares a certain demographic trait that is saying, I really need elderly healthcare. And this comes from the Hispanic community in my region, as opposed to, this is something that through and through came through, but I'm not really sure what is the core feature. So I'm a big believer in first, breaking down into every single part and then reconstituting it. keep in mind, when I did a lot of the grand deba-oriented projects, even BERT wasn't around. So there is a lot that has happened since with respect to just the raw text. I have, meanwhile, found that put aside text clustering, a lot of behavioral signals and other extraneous signals actually speak much more so than the words of the few that we are collecting. And that angle, from that side, I would definitely go much more towards multimodal transformers that can vectorize any text input and compare that with any behavioral signal that is coming in as well. And building clusters on top of that is much more interesting. I want to add the third angle too, which I think is important, which is cluster size is one thing. Cluster distance, regardless of the size, is equally important in my opinion. And that almost is a political point to make, but basically what I mean by that is to say how far away an opinion is. Like, does it belong to the same context or does it just belong completely elsewhere? That actually implies a lot of things. Like, for example, when we were looking at Keystone XL pipeline, there were two main themes. Everything could really be grouped in two main themes. If you ask for, give me top 40 clusters, the top 40 you would get would all be about either job loss for the United States citizens or for, environmental impact. There was a fairly small, fairly lightly distributed cluster that really didn't align with either, which was that most of the Keystone XL pipeline actually went through Native American lands, which are actually governed differently. This was not a major concern, but this was very distinct from everything else that has been talked about. So any system that we like, there is usually a cliff past which we can say, yeah, these two themes are incongruous. They talk about different things. Being able to make sure we can acknowledge each and every one of them is really important as well.
Cool, thank you.
That's what I like to nerd out on the most, so we can talk much more on specifics of this. But yeah.
There's another way to answer your question, Richard, which I think is kind of if one goes down the transformer path, there's a question which is like, how good is the state of the art at answering like nuanced questions about, maybe even you've got the same topic and the same broad sentiment, but there's like a different valence to the comment. I don't know, like one person says like elder care is insufficiently provided by the government, and another person says elder care is a stress in our family because we have to do it ourselves or something. And those two things might be kind of the same, but they might actually be different policy implications. And with this stuff, broadly speaking, if you try quickly with a class like a transformer-based classifier, you'll get an accuracy into the 90s probably, but not up to 100. And then the question is that good enough for deploying a system? And the answer may be, well, it's fine as long as you kind of iteratively measure how good your classifier is and put error bars on your numbers as a result. So it's not that hard to take samples of the 100 million responses that you thought you put in group X and then check that your percentage estimate for X is like not too far off the real number in a sample.
Sorry, talking about classifier or this abstractive clustering?
Well, I think of okay, that's a good point. So let me think clustering, and then you can break clustering into a classification problem where you have like a category that's like, I've never seen this before.
Yeah, I mean, clustering is in a way, like one can think of this as a continuously iterative cycle where the clustering will give you the labels, and then you will iterate a classification on top of the labels. And then those that remain outside is telling an equally important story where you couldn't confidently place something there. Usually in the very first, scoop, you will catch all of the form letters, all of the bot-generated content, for it will land fairly similar, or it might land in a manner that is repeatedly disparate, such as, arriving at the random hour of the day of all of the submissions, coming in. Those are the things that you can actually catch rather than within a peak window where people are most likely to comment or when a form letter was released. So there are ways in which we can take those into account as well. It ultimately always comes down to the question of, what are we trying to do with the collected data? Are we trying to come up with a better way in which we can survey? Are we trying to empower a small community to be able to make a case with their point of view and voice? Because I do think, based on that, one may be able to employ slightly different strategies too.
Cool.
I'm looking
Yeah,
for raised hands, but I also have a question to ask.
Go ahead. Did someone raise hand? Is that what you said?
No, I'm watching for raised hands.
Yeah.
So how do you think about sample bias in the systems you've built thus far?
Yeah. So sample bias also tells a story. Sample bias is very real, especially with respect to any digital first, comment collection system. It will skew the participants. With that said, we can work with the data that we've had. There's, graceful exit answer to your question, which is to say we should, like, the way to eliminate sample bias does not come directly from the system in and of itself, but it comes from being able to popularize the system the right way. With that said, I do think there's a lot that can be done on that front, where other signals that the data sources might not be paying attention to can systematically be taken into account as well by the entity that is collecting this feedback.
Do other people have questions?
I heard something from someone. But yeah, I'd love to just discuss on a fairly open-ended flow on, what are ways in which you guys think a public feedback collection can be empowering. One of the angles that I'd love to particularly think about more and more is what are specific use cases? It always comes back down to a use case for me, for I guess having been a fairly like application action oriented thinking. I've been gravitating quite a bit towards home lending and ownership. For it was a discussion theme that came up in a couple of disparate times for me, so I think there might be something there for being able to make collective cases. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that front.
I think the focus on specific applications is great. What would you do with home lending and home ownership?
Well, it's two parts. One of them is that, there's a lot of people that would be able to pay off their loans, but they're not really getting loans. Hence, this is something that can empower both, the bank that would be able to receive this case from, a collective set of data that, meets the two ends. It goes back to, I guess, a philosophy that I really gathered from the retail angle, which is, you can simplify a lot of services or product businesses to the simple idea of people want to get a good product and companies want to offer a good product. So how can we make the two ends meet in the middle? So it ultimately comes down to like the right information relay by seeing, where this falls through. Peter and Brittany, there's another angle that I think would be interesting to discuss, which is thoughts on like ways in which this can plug into some of the other civic participation data collection processes and the ethics angles that we've been working on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that side too.
Well, two things. I find myself watching, like looking at this and thinking, okay, if we built a system that basically is kind of the pirate version of the Grand Débat in France. Mm-hmm. So not a situation where the government has gone in and said, we're going to do this, but a situation where you manage to get enough people in a society excited about doing it themselves. What happens? Like, is that a constructive intervention in the politics of a particular jurisdiction? Like, would it snowball? And would it capture issues that weren't being addressed well? Would it change the positions of political parties? Would it help to overrule lobbyists who have an outsized influence on policy, or would they in fact find a way to commandeer it? And what's a good what's a good experiment to try?
I think. Yeah, one thing that I realized while I was working actively on the political angle was that good experiments are a dime a dozen. They keep coming. Every month there will be another issue. Back then it was gun violence and gun rights was, peak. So there were a lot of lobbying groups. There was very few attention paid into, what each local jurisdiction is trying to make a case for. It was actually really interesting to be able to look at Twitter on specific regions and see the disparate content of, even in a fairly red state, you would see pockets where people actually say, no, this is not what I think. And that was actually coming in from a fairly weak data source, which is Twitter. That some of that work I've done was with Citadel, with a hedge fund, on trying to help them understand, what to invest in, especially at the face of specific new events. Then I said, well, I'd rather build a hedge fund than sell to these guys. Plus, this is more so information arbitrage than trying to make value with the information. So I shied away from pursuing that angle, but that's a different story, I guess. So, but my short answer is definitely, I think there would be a lot of, it would be able to empower making a case that actually taps into people that contributed. And one of the most significant pieces that we have seen again and again is people's connection to a case once they have sent something in is actually going to be much, much, much more powerful. And net neutrality was one of the more interesting things where, I mean, this is more my personal opinion, I guess. Net neutrality wasn't the biggest deal issue, especially right on the wake of Keystone XL pipeline and Trump re-election. It actually got a lot of traction though, and that was partly because the nature of the issue was fairly well connected with the ability to be able to contribute and give feedback on it, which also gave a reason for people to say, hey, I do want to see how this pans out. So it changes the nature of the civic participant as well, in my opinion.
Speaking of VC funds and hedge funds, and you had an item in your slide deck, which was shareholder activism.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been this one very interesting example of this activist investment company called, I think, Engine Number One, that managed to force one of the major oil companies to adopt serious long-term climate commitments.
Right.
And so, and the interesting things about that are, one, you might find situations where companies as political entities or powerful entities in the world are somewhat non-aligned, and if you can spot ways in which they're not aligned with human values, then it might be profitable to take a position that twists that calls into visibility the fact that this is not aligned, and then makes the argument that the value of the company is better if it actually takes its stakeholders seriously. And so maybe you can get a loop going where you do some of this and then more of this. So the question there is how much have you thought about that? What would it look like? Could we go and pick a few companies and try and spot non-alignment in them? Absolutely.
Richard, if your point is about this subject, feel free to unmic and unmute and go at it. The thing that I want to say for diving in more is, yes, the right way to do this would actually be, everything comes back down to if you can have 1% alignment. This is the case in a lot of European countries, at least that I know, of shareholders. The point that 1% is making has to be addressed by the board. If you have 5%, that actually needs to be discussed and deliberated and released upon the next board meeting results for their Q1s. So that is something that is really interesting. There's actually a lot that's I look into Engine One quite a bit for their impact they have taken on oil. Shareholder activism is quite a win-win between a bunch of parties. On one side, we have the collectives, right? It is, say, Vanguard that I am using. It is in Vanguard's interest to be able to say, hey, we are doing this in a flow where your feedback is something we will pay attention to. It is really pretty much the only differentiator left once you take out the fees, etc. On the other side, you have a lot of pension funds that are massive that probably on their own might be able to, once you synergize between them, have enough voice that can connect to be able to make a 5% case. then the question becomes, what is the technical proof that can showcase that you do have 5% alignment? Was it Richard that raised the hand? And Aviv? Aviv, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to turn on video. Sorry, I'm like just randomly waiting for. Oh, some people are coming in right now. I just jumped on this last minute, but I'm actually also in touch with Shareholder Commons. I don't know if any of you are, but this is the organization that's really trying to push this universal owner approach, the Nginx. So the like, I feel like the thesis there that Nginx has, and in terms of the way that it's approaching things, and Shareholder Commons more broadly, is focused on the economy does better if like its alignment with the overall economic well-being as opposed to overall human well-being, which is like very closely connected. But I think it's like that's just a nuance that I think is pretty important, because the pension funds do better when the economy does better. In theory, they should also do better when humanity does better, but that isn't. But they are at least it's much easier to get alignment around the economy as a whole. So that's just the one piece of nuance I wanted to add to that. And if folks are interested in that, I've been working with them a little bit on the Twitter situation, which is a very complex, multifaceted piece. And there's a Reuters piece actually that goes into that, and a podcast that goes into a lot more detail that I can link to from Rick Alexander at Shareholder Commons, who's trying to use that logic to try to get the deal into a more positive direction, however it ends up going.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about this, actually, if you want to share. I've talked with a couple other entities like citizen shareholders, etc., that are starting to do similar lines of work. I've actually not connected with Shareholder Commons, but would love to learn more on basically like what are ways in which we can jumpstart the making a case from a collective, basically.
So just to check, Richard, did you have a question that you didn't manage to ask?
It was more of a comment that these sorts of techniques and technologies can also be abused. So a number of years ago, I was working in a place that offered a very similar kind of service. So there was I think something like 30,000 different sort of like suggestions by employees of a very large like hospital chain. It's sort of like a virtual like suggestion box of like, you know, like paragraphs and stuff. And we did a very similar kind of analysis. It turned out the hospital only wanted to figure out if there was any sort of unionizing activity or anything in that direction. And they didn't care about anything else.
Yep, sounds about right. It's not that different from, I guess, the earlier cases we were talking about, where like the interest of the central decision maker is not necessarily to address the issue; it is to make the issue go away or to avoid other pieces. So, I mean, I definitely see that, and that is it's more of a problem of human nature, in my opinion. That then my question would be: was there a way in which the analysis, well, in your case, it might be different, for the analysis was commissioned by an entity that had a specific goal. But say, you know, if the hospital workers were able to do the same or get to the same conclusions on their own, probably their unionization efforts or anything that is along those lines could have been much more effective. In fact, you know, the points that they are trying to argue for would have been more obvious. So, just like anything else, I think, you know, the right tool in the right hands, like one half of this is going towards like, well, installing, you know, opt-in spyware into everyone's laptops, or, you know, Cambridge Analytica style. The other side of it, this is, you know, well, that data already exists and is being monetized against you by Google and what have you. Is there a way to actually make it so that you can make a profit out of it, or make a case with, you know, your own opinion? So those are some of the angles that I think are worth exploring here.
Yeah, and I think to Peter's point too earlier, you know, if it's outside of like a central, like a corporation who has vested interest or a government who has vested interest, if it's just available and people are contributing to it and everyone can see it and everyone has access to it, like how does that change things? If you're just like just presenting this data that 60% of people in Poughkeepsie feel this way about gun control.
Mhm.
You know, like, and it's not, you know, the government has no say. It's just a special sort of group who just this is the data, this is what it says.
Right.
So, I think the story of abortion is interesting here as a specific example where we have very good polling on a countrywide level. Though it is true that on a statewide level, I don't know how well it tracks, but I think it's like it's a very concrete thing with a bunch of polling that's like very salient. I would be careful about using it publicly as an issue for a variety of reasons, but I think it like might be a really useful example, especially given obviously the Citizen Assembly on abortion, which was found, you know, transformational to the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the concerns that jump out to you from a public use case?
For abortion?
Yes, or like from there extrapolating to other cases that we could be discussing.
Oh, I mean, it just puts you in a particular partisan camp, and if it depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to do that, then that's fine. But it just I just like if it's seen that this is a thing that's only used by people on the left, then that becomes more difficult for having broad mandate. And so if there's a way to have a set of issues that is able to transcend that, then that's initial issues that transcend that. That might be helpful. So I mean, basically think about like what will Tucker Carlson say, right? Like, and like maybe you just like can't do anything about that. Like, but that's sort of the model here, at least from a U.S. perspective. I mean, obviously in a European context or another context, it's going to be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think to bolster on that, it is fairly easy to turn this into like a targeting system once, you know, you do have active, you know, civic participants where it is traceable. There are ways in which, you know, that could be dealt with as well. That adds different layers of nuances on this. There have been a couple of really interesting cases coming from Finland and I think even with Brazil with respect to some internet reform where they crowdsource a lot of feedback to build towards, you know, legislation development. And I think some of those can be interesting role models. I think the most important, like most explicit example that really highlights this would be shareholder activism, where there is a layer of information to share with respect to how much shares you own. So how can we make that, you know, it's basically a verification on, you know, you being able to own shares and a certain amount without being able to release your identity. I do believe, you know, with a lot of recent Web3 developments, this could also become a solvable problem with respect to being able to answer a question and validate the answer without necessarily having the answer.
I want to see if there's any last question perhaps from someone who hasn't been. We have a few of us who have been speaking a lot. Are any of the other people sitting with a question that we can close with? If not, then maybe we should thank Deger.
Alyssa just raised the hand. So
yeah, admittedly, I missed a lot of the beginning, but I'm curious to know. There's been some talk here on this call about shareholder activism. I'm curious what your thoughts are with regard to employee activism.
I think employee activism is easier in terms of its applicability for, you know, with proving shareholder and ownership is a much harder challenge with respect to being able to have an opinion be taken into account, while the employer side is much easier and explicit. And also it is much more dangerous in a way for, you know, this to be able to easily bubble up towards, you know, union bashing, etc. But then again, you know, we've been dealing with this in a variety of forms since like early 18th century. So I don't think in a way the problem that is to solve is prevention of, you know, an interest of a central party. There's more, so the way I see it is, are we able to develop pieces that can empower people to be able to do that? It is not a space that I have a ton of experience in, or my previous work doesn't really build towards there, but would love to hear your thoughts on what are ways in which even we can go towards a quick case study or, you know, demonstrate the point with respect to employee activism. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that.
Yeah.
I mean, just pick any employee anyone that works at a Fortune 500 company that's activated on any issue today. I think you could activate. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a certain amount of courage needed there, but yeah, I'm not sure exactly tactically how you do, but we can talk about it.
There's plenty there. But yeah.
I found this to be a really thought-provoking conversation, and it feels like we should sit with a few of these ideas, maybe also sit with the tech stack that you have and the one that we've been building in the Statistics of Stories project, and figure out, okay, can we repurpose some of the things you've got, and then just pick one of these to see how much better we can do this with the fancy new language models we have. So I think that those are really exciting things for us to explore going forward. And I just want to thank you for a great presentation today.
You're welcome.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you everyone for coming. If you have any ideas, questions, things you want to talk about, just give a shout out through the Mattermost channel or email, and then we go from there.
Oh yeah, that's a reminder for people who are, if you're not in our Mattermost conversation, open for a flat clone thing, I will pop the link here in the chat. It's objective.is/chat. All right, thanks everyone.
Everyone.